So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this discussion of climate change and displacement. We've been really excited to have this discussion because obviously it's very topical and it's only going to get more so, frankly. And we've got some really excellent panelists with us today. We may well have more joining us later. I'll just start by introducing our panelists who are here, and then we'll leap into the first question. I'd just like to remind the audience that they are always very welcome to post questions into the chat, and I will relay those to our panelists at an appropriate juncture. So I'll just introduce our panelists in the order they're appearing on my screen. So I'll start with Professor Salim Ul-Hook, who is the Director of the International Centre for Climate Change and Development, and also Professor at the Independent University of Bangladesh, as well as Associate of the International Institute on Environment and Development in the UK, and also Chair of the Expert Advisory Group for the Climate Vulnerable Forum, and also Senior Advisor on Locally Led Adaptation with Global Centre on Adaptation, headquartered in the Netherlands. He's an expert in adaptation to climate change in the most vulnerable developing country, and has been a lead author of the 3rd, 4th and 5th assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And then next on my screen is John Connell, who is a Professor of Human Geography at the University of Sydney and has worked on development and migration issues in the Pacific region for the past 40 years, particularly in Papua New Guinea, but also in the atolls of Kiribati and Tuvalu and so on, who are usually regarded as the leading candidates for disappearance and thus who need population resettlement. He's also published several books. The last main one was Islands at Risk in 2013. And then next on my screen is Scott Leckie, who is an international human rights lawyer and also the director and founder of Displacement Solutions, a global not-for-profit NGO dedicated to resolving displacement generated by global warming and climate change. He also founded Oneness World Foundation, a research think tank exploring questions of world-centric political evolution and new forms of global governance and world citizenship. So those are our panelists today. And if everybody's happy to, we can just jump straight into the first question, which is, can you introduce the current climate situation in your country or in the country that your organisation operates in? Should we go in the same order as introductions, maybe? Salim, could you start us off there?
Sure. So thank you very much for that introduction and for inviting me to join this interesting discussion. So I'm primarily located in Bangladesh. I'm at this moment in the UK, where I'll be attending COP26 in Glasgow in a few days' time. But in Bangladesh, I think anybody who's read anything in the media about climate change knows Bangladesh is one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change. Just a very short description: we are a population of around 170 million people, the 8th largest population country in the world, but we have a tiny area geographically of less than 150,000 square kilometers, which means our population density is well over 1,000 per square kilometer, which is usually what you see in city-states like Hong Kong and Singapore, but not in whole countries. The geography of our country is on the delta of 2 of the world's biggest rivers, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, which flow through Bangladesh into the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal. And so for a variety of these reasons, including the fact that we are a relatively very poor country, although we are becoming less poor with time, we are one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And one of the vulnerabilities, I would say the first vulnerability, or the most pressing vulnerability, is the low-lying coastal region, from where we are already seeing people being forced to move because of cyclonic storms, seawater ingress, sea level rise, salinity intrusion, a whole variety of reasons that are forcing people to just simply abandon their livelihoods and their places of living and moving. And that is a rapidly growing phenomenon. It's not always easy to say they are moving because of climate change, but it's becoming even more and more verifiable that is the underlying cause for them being forced to move. And just a couple of final points about that. In Bangladesh, the move from rural to urban migration, with or without climate change, but now exacerbated by climate change, is primarily coming to Dhaka city. So Dhaka city, which is the capital, is the fastest growing megacity in the world. And the expectation is, in the order of 10 million migrants over the next decade. Dhaka will just burst at the seams. So one of the programs that we are trying to develop collectively, government, civil society, local governments, is to identify about 24 smaller, relatively smaller towns that can become what we call climate resilient, migrant friendly towns, and attract these potential climate migrants in the order of 500,000 to 1 million per town, so that the next 10 million climate migrants don't end up in the slums of Dhaka city and can go to these towns and at least get a better quality of life there. There'll still be migrants, they're still forced to move, but at least they won't be as bad as living in the slums in Dhaka. So it's sort of what we call a second order adaptation. The first order being helping them survive where they are, but knowing that they won't be able to survive forever. And in fact, the period of survival is shortening. But then secondly, seeing if we can help them move under their own volition, not forced to move, not even planned moving, but just enabling people to make a decision to go and facilitating that. Very early stages, but we are very hopeful that that might work. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Salim. That's really interesting. And I'm sure we'll be discussing kind of urban management in this context a little bit later in the discussion as well. John, how about you?
Thank you. I think I'm sort of generally talking about the Pacific, but since that represents 2/3 of the Earth's surface, I'll try and focus on a limited number of places. It's really interesting to listen to Dhaka in the context of the Pacific, because we think of it as so different. But some of the small capital cities in the Pacific, in Funafuti and Tuvalu and Tarawa, in Kiribati, Majuro too, in the Marshall Islands, their population densities are almost as high as Dhaka. So they experience some of the same problems. And those problems are basically associated, of course, with rising temperatures. What impact does that have? It has impacts on sea and on land, particularly in many places on sea. So there's the migration of fish and fisheries is beginning to happen. It poses threats to livelihoods. On land, of course, temperature increases pose other kinds of problems. In urban areas particularly, which are growing and becoming more dense, higher temperatures mean the probability of some kinds of diseases increasing in urban heat islands like asthma, TB, and so on. And higher humidity goes with that. So urban life is becoming just that little bit more difficult. But what is also happening is some degree of sea level rise. Sea level rise in most of the region is perhaps of the order of about 5 millimeters a year, which is actually quite small. So in itself, it has very limited effect. But the temperature changes and sea level rise come with an increased frequency and an increased strength of cyclones, increasingly common in the region with more devastating impacts. Increasing also floods, particularly in coastal areas as people move down to coast, clear areas. Floods are becoming much more of a hazard and so on. And also, paradoxically, with droughts as well. In the last few years, fresh water has had to be imported into some of the smaller Pacific Island states when droughts go on and on. So you have a cyclone over your island. It's really difficult to plant and grow things, or to grow things for another 10 months at least. So there are very serious threats to food security. Most of those threats are most severe in some of the coral atoll states and some of the atolls particularly, where again, there are very high densities like the famous Carteret Islands that Ursula may come and talk about, and Scott will probably talk about later on. Very high population densities and a number of people have moved away. So they're great threats to food security above all and to livelihoods as these changes continue.
Thank you, John. That's really interesting and really shows just how serious a threat is facing a lot of places now. Scott, shall we turn to you next?
Sure. Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and it's great to be on a panel with all of these wonderful human beings who are trying so hard, as are we, to get this issue of climate displacement onto the top of the global agenda where it belongs. Okay, so I'll take quickly a much more macro approach initially, and just simply give an overview of the scale of this problem globally, which is astronomical. There's a wide variety of estimates about how many people are going to be displaced and who are being displaced because of climate change and related environmental factors. And that ranges anywhere from the low side of, let's say, around 216 million that the World Bank recently just produced, with all of the caveats that you need to associate with a World Bank estimate of that nature, all the way up to 600 million by Climate Central, and some estimates even higher than that, closer to 1 billion. So we're talking about a scale of displacement which is many times higher than current levels of internal displacement or refugee flows in the world today. UNHCR has responsibility right now for 71 million displaced people. So you can just see the scale of the question that we're talking about. So, you know, we take the perspective of, yes, it's a huge problem, and yes, gargantuan changes need to occur in law and policy and practice, but we can't just throw our arms up in the air and say it's too big of a problem, we can't deal with it. We have to deal with it practically. And that's the way that we have gone about working on this issue in a whole range of countries, including with Ursula, for instance, in the Carteret Islands. I mean, many years ago, all the way back in 2007, we tried to negotiate a big land deal for the islanders so that they could move on to the larger island of Bougainville. And all the pieces of that puzzle were put in place. There was 7,000 acres of land ready to be purchased and sold and given to them, and then it all fell through at the last moment. But that type of methodology is what we're doing in a number of countries around the world. We've worked in about 35 countries now with climate displaced people, always from the angle of, let's try to solve this problem if we can. So amazing things are happening in Panama with the Gunayala indigenous group, for instance, who are moving from man-made islands off the coast of eastern Panama onto the mainland, which is land that's also under their possession, under their control, given their autonomous arrangements. There's interesting things happening in all sorts of places across the Solomon Islands nearby. There's lots of things underway in Salim Bai's country of Bangladesh, which I love so much, and so many other places across the world, including the United States, which is far more under threat than most people realize, in all sorts of locations. And there's two or three places there right now already which are in the process of being moved: in the state of Alaska, the state of Louisiana, a whole number of communities in Florida, and even Massachusetts that are under looming threat. There's also, of course, lest we forget, the decision by the government of Indonesia to relocate the entire capital city of Jakarta, 10 million plus people, which is in part a climate change matter, and discussions underway in Lagos even to consider relocating Lagos, and the list goes on and on and on. We're talking about a huge global problem. Even here in Australia, where I'm speaking from, even though you can't tell that from my accent, there are 300,000 coastal properties which are threatened with permanent inundation at a collected value of around 400 billion Australian dollars. So let's not also forget the massive financial costs associated with losing this #1 asset of most people, which is their land or their home. So I can go in further detail on a whole number of pathways, but I'll leave it, I'll send it back to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Scott. That's quite eye-opening. I didn't realize there were quite that many communities around the world already facing or in the process of moving. And Mizan, it's good to have you with us again. Salim has already introduced the situation in Bangladesh. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing at ICAD and at the LUCCC to try and deal with some of these issues, maybe?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Happy to join today's meeting. I think we are only the panelists are listening to each other, not many audience participants from outside. Am I right? Anyway, so I missed what Dr. Salim already shared. But at ICAD, I also coordinate the LDC Universities Consortium on Climate Change, you might be knowing, which is a LDC University partnership. And we try to build capacity of these governments to address climate change. Now, and I'm also a very long-time negotiator. So this is about me. Now, coming to what we have been doing at ICAD regarding displacements, you know, South Asia and Bangladesh particularly is a displacement hotspot in the world for two reasons. One is Bangladesh being the most populous nation on earth, except Singapore and Hong Kong, which are island states or city states kind of, so no comparison to them. And also incidence of poverty, though we are graduating soon into 2 years from LDC status into middle income country, but still because of huge population, we are still a low income country. Okay, so these are the main two reasons. And another reason displacement is a serious problem for us is we have no space for retreat. We have nowhere else to go except, you know, staying within. And research has shown that really people, particularly the little older generation, wants to stay back to their original homelands, to their original abode, provided adequate support. But that is not available internationally. You know, I'm a long-time climate finance negotiator, so I'm very pessimistic about it for this upcoming COP2. Adaptation finance is the discriminated child of the parents. And also money doesn't flow where this is most needed. Money flows with bilateral relationship, colonial, you know, legacy relationship. That is another factor. So in Bangladesh at ICAD, we are trying to kind of develop two models. For the last 3 years, we have been working on a model which we call climate resilient migrant friendly towns, about which we have published in Science in June this year. So because as I mentioned, we have no place to retreat. That is the reason, no place for planned relocation. So we are trying to move, redirect these displaced refugees from coming to Dhaka and to other cities and redirecting it to satellite towns where the government now is currently investing for developing heavy infrastructures. And this is one of our model, but this is a very tough task because for developing migrant-friendly towns for the refugees, we need to do lots of homework because those cities and towns have their own, you know, priorities. And there we have to kind of build into the adaptation priorities and activities. So lots of hardwares and softwares are needed, you know, before we can really tell that this is kind of a model workable or successful model, but we are experimenting. Another model we are trying to promote as kind of a long-time negotiator and staying in Western societies for long years. I know many of the Western countries, they are suffering from demographic deficit and your aging population. So your countries, many of your countries now and in future will need, you know, young labor force, young skilled labor force. So in the Science article, we have argued that based on projected demands in the UK, for example, or in Germany, and there are precedents about this. So based on projected demands in your countries, if the bilaterally, if UK or Germany comes to the Bangladesh government, because multilateral diplomacy is extremely cumbersome, time consuming, you see the GCM, we have this multilateral framework, but I'm not sure when something concrete we may get out of this GCM, Global Compact on Migration. That is why our argument is bilaterally, the deal can be struck in 3 months, 6 months, and based on your projected demands, UK, Germany can come to Bangladesh or India because we are labor surplus country. And from the displacement hotspots, our government has a policy which is called name a National Strategy for Management of Disaster and Climate-Induced Internal Displacement, which was adopted in 2015-16. There is one very good idea that from this hotspot, displacement hotspots, family members, young and able-bodied family members can be selected and they can get training in jointly supported educational and training institutions based on the specifications of your demand in terms of skills. And they can move after 2, 3, 4 years of training, they can move to your countries, even not for permanent residencies, even on temporary residence, for example, 3 to 5 years, as kind of a circular migration. And many countries in the world have got these kind of, bilateral agreements. So this is a win-win solution. And I can vouch for the fact that I have done an extensive literature review on the impact of economic migrants to Western societies. And not a single work I could see which kind of depicted a negative picture of economic migrants, because these migrants behave as good boys, they pay more tax than they enjoy from social security benefit. If you allow just 1 minute, I'll share the story. In 2016, I myself am a kind of political animal, so and staying in America, I'm interested in American politics. So in 2016, when I was observing, listening to the presidential debates, then in the second presidential debate of 2016 between Hillary and Trump, then when Trump was speaking against this immigration, then Hillary, retorted back that you, Mr. Aspiring President, you being a billionaire, never pay taxes. But those migrants pay taxes and they enjoy less than they pay for. So you don't speak, please, because you are not the right person. So this is, our argument that your need can be satisfied with a skilled young labor, which is good for your revenue generation, for mobility of your dynamism of your labor market, as well as for, and this is excellent also for the host countries, sending countries, because they also promote growth in the host countries, in Bangladesh. I will cite one example. In 2017, this remittance, expatriate remittance amounted to $417 billion. But the ODA, for example, or climate finance barely reaches $150 billion a year. So what is better? Remittance is better, which provides win-win options for both sides of the aisle. So this is a model that in negotiation, I'm going to Glasgow. In any opportunity, I will strongly advocate for this model too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mizan. Some really good points there, and it actually leads very well into the next question, because you're talking about how economically positive economic migrants generally are for the economy of the area they move to. And my next point was going to be how, unfortunately, in spite of that, there is a rising tide of anti-migrant feeling across most of the world. And so my next question to all of you is, what provision is there for displaced people in your country or in the country that you primarily operate in? And what rights do displaced people have, either internally displaced or coming from abroad? Shall we start with you again, Salim?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier, and Mizan has elaborated on our program of developing climate resilient, migrant friendly towns. Let me parse that a little bit. The first phrase of climate resilience applies to the physical infrastructure of towns. So if they are flood prone, how do we make them, protect them from floods? If they are heat prone, how do we protect them from heat waves? If they are cyclone prone, how do we protect them from cyclones? And that investment is going on. The good news is that the national and international investors like the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank have now got the message that they have to build climate resilient infrastructure, not just business as usual infrastructure. That's good. The second part of the phrase is much more complicated and speaks to your question, which is how do we make the town migrant friendly? And the hostility between host population and migrant population is a universal phenomenon. Every city, every country, everywhere, always. And it goes through phases. There's an initial hostility, but then over a period of time, the migrants then become citizens, particularly the next generation. And then they are accepted as citizens. And so what we are working on is cultural, social ways of getting the migrants to be treated as fellow citizens. It's what we call a pathway to citizenship with local populations. And one of the most effective ways that we have found, it is what my center focuses on, is education. So young girls and young boys from the coastal area, which I mentioned is the primary source of the migrants, can come to these towns to, say, high school or a college education. They stay in the town for 3 or 4 years to gain a degree. During that period, they effectively become friends with the local population, college students, their fellow students. And by the time they graduate, they are effectively citizens of the city that they're now living in, even though they didn't come from there. One big advantage that we have in Bangladesh, which other places don't necessarily have, is that they are ethnically, religiously, and linguistically the same. You can't tell by looking at a person that he has or she has come from somewhere else. We are all Bangladeshis. We look the same. We all speak Bangla. We speak the same language. The only difference is somebody has an accent. So you can tell from the accent that they are from Noakhali or from Chittagong. But that's it. Which is not the case in many places. You know, in Europe, I go to a place in Europe, I stand out. I may be British, which I am, but I stand out. You know, they don't see me as a Brit, they see me as a South Asian. So the visual aspect of the ethnicity is something that is in our favor. The language is in our favor. The big difference between host population and the incoming migrant population is more class. The incoming migrants are poor, they're living in the slums. The host population are sort of middle class, and so they regard the slum dwellers as, you know, thieves, bad people, servants to work in our house, but not fellow citizens. So there's a class distinction between those who are relatively better off versus those who are relatively worse off, but not the other distinctions, which actually makes it very easy in Bangladesh. As I said, over a period of time, once the school kids, the children of these migrants in the slum, go to college and get a job, they are then indistinguishable from the local population, and nobody will say, you know, this person is from somewhere else. This person is a friend of mine. We went to school together, and that makes a huge difference. That segueing from being perceived as an outsider to being perceived as an insider is what we are trying to do. And it's to do with social norms, with people knowing each other, getting to know each other, you know, spending time together, having, you know, festivals together, coming to each other's house. It's not money. Money doesn't make it happen. It's social capital, building social capital. And that's what we are investing our capabilities and research. It's an action research program, if you like. We don't know if it'll succeed, but we're going to try very hard. Thank you.
Sounds really positive, Salim. Thank you. John, how about you?
Yeah, let me go back to the coral atolls again, because there's basically 3 coral atoll states in the South Pacific. I think most people talk about Kiribati and Tuvalu. There's another one in another part of the world, the Maldives, but less than 1 million people live on coral atolls. Should be easy. Only 1 million people. They won't all have to move tomorrow. We should be able to deal with that particular problem. But if you think about coral atolls, highest point above sea level is 2 meters. There are no mountains to retreat to. There's no inland. Inland doesn't exist. You can't go somewhere else. And population densities are already very high. So if people are not literally being forced out by environmental change, but to some extent, as populations grow, being forced out by livelihoods, the inability to have an adequate livelihood, and one that is threatened intermittently by floods, by cyclones, and so on. So where would they move? If they move from places like Kiribati and Tuvalu, they must move to some other state. And some other state, that other state will have a different cultural, different culture, a different language, and be a long way away from where they started from. Let me leave that aside for a moment and look at what has, in some cases, been happening. In Fiji, there are a lot of local movements, but those are very, very local movements within maybe half a mile, 1 kilometer. That's just about possible to accommodate, and even that has proved quite difficult. I spent some time 5 or 6 years ago on an island off the north coast of New Guinea called Manam. Manam is a volcano. It's a beautiful, typical volcano, but it keeps erupting, which is a nuisance. People die, which is a nuisance as well. So the government decided basically 15 years ago to move the population of Manam onto the mainland. But the local people on the mainland were not terribly enthusiastic about that. They would be on their land. They weren't their people. They had a different culture. They knew them. They saw them often enough at markets. Some of them married with them, but they're not ours. And we need that land for our children in the future. So the whole thing broke down on land. There was no land to be found to rehouse these people, which local people were willing to give. So what happened was some people still live in those places on the mainland. Many have drifted back to the volcanic island, Manam, but threatened by a government that says, well, you can't do that because we're not going to give you services. We're not going to build a school. We're not going to give you an aid post. So you've got to stay on the mainland where it's safe. But it's not safe if you're being threatened by other local people. So what has also happened is that many people have drifted off into town. So it's a process of urbanization as people escape these kinds of hazards. And much the same thing is happening in other places. A classic migration move 75 years ago in the Pacific was from a phosphate island called Barnaba. People moved off Barnaba to make way for a mine. And they moved 1,000 kilometers away to one of the islands of Fiji. But 75 years later, Fijian people are still saying, hang on, that is our land. We may want it. You know, we've got more children than we had. It looks nice land. It's not yours. You're from somewhere else. So 75 years later, we still have these distinct cultural differences that threaten the long-term residents of these migrants, in this case from Barnaba. So it's the same in many parts of the Pacific. And in many, what is adding to that, I think, in many ways, is that where people migrate to land, they're not able, because they get not enough land, if they get any land at all, to generate an adequate livelihood. So they may be allowed enough land for a food garden, but not to be able to produce something like cocoa or coffee or whatever to give them incomes. So they too eventually drift off into urban areas where, as we just heard, it's at least possible to find some place to live, but it's not particularly adequate. Hence, people are also moving overseas. We can talk about that later on.
Thank you, John. That's really interesting that after 75 years, there is still that same tension and distinction, because I think in a lot of cases, 3 generations is more than enough for migrants to fully integrate. You know, my grandparents were migrants to the UK, and yet I consider myself British, and have never been accused of being otherwise, you know. So I think it's often the case that people will normally integrate within 3 generations, and that's interesting that that isn't happening there. And I'm assuming that's down to either real or perceived land or resource scarcity, that there's still that tension there.
Well, it's partly because people were resettled as a group and were given a particular island. So in fact, they stayed as a group. If you're on your own particular island, speaking the language that you came with and practicing the culture that you came with, it's a little bit difficult to integrate. But like you, my grandparents too came from another country to England, but I managed to, I think, in due course to fit in.
Thank you. Scott, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, a whole bunch of things. So once again, let me take a macro level approach again to all of these issues. So remind me at the end if I forget to talk about billionaires, because I'm going to say something very important about billionaires. But first, let's start with the question of land broadly. Well, let's actually start with the question of displacement. super important to remember that the overwhelming majority of the hundreds of millions of people that are going to be displaced because of climate change will seek in the first instance to move inside their own countries. They will not first and foremost try to cross an international border, okay? This is incredibly important because the worldview now is that Western countries are going to be swamped by all of these people coming from poor third world countries and ruin our economies and so on and so forth, right? So it's simply not true. In the long run, they will definitely try if there's no domestic option. But in most cases, with the unique exception of the Coral Atoll Islands and some of the other islands and some very low-lying places, people will try, if they can, to stay within their own culture, near to their own people, near to the graves of their ancestors, and all the other attributes of life. You know, even in this interconnected, globalized world, less than 4% of people live outside their country of birth, even though it's so easy to do so for those with resources. So it's the exception to the rule. It's not what most people want to do. Having said that, I totally favor very open borders, and our world is made a much better place, you know, as we can all see if we simply look at the facts, as Mizanbai was saying and others were saying. As we mingle more, as we interact more, as we get used to each other more, as we have more contact, problems that could arise fade away. And it can happen in a domestic context, like Salimbai was speaking about in Bangladesh, but it can also happen internationally as well. It's really important to remember that. So that's the first point. The second point is there's often an emphasis on there's not enough land to resettle these people. There's no way is there enough land. And in certain instances, that's totally true. You know, you can fit 2 Bangladeshis in the state of Victoria, where I'm sitting right now. We have a total population of 7 million, right? If we had the same population density as you guys, right? 340 million people living in little old Victoria, no way, you know? So yes, there's land shortages in individual countries, particularly in the small island states, et cetera, where there's no alternative. But we did a global study several years ago, and we took a very high level estimate of the amount of land that each person displaced would get. Our calculations are, it's very detailed, but I'll give you the most basic one. 0.14% of the Earth's land surface is needed to rehouse and relocate every single climate displaced person in the world using a high estimate of 750 million people, okay? Even if you gave them a whole acre of land each, it's only 0.068%. It's well under 1% no matter how you slice it. It's the size of Tasmania or the size of Costa Rica viewed globally. And you could squeeze everybody in the whole world into the land, that space, and give them enough to have a livelihood of their own, a house, etc. So it's not a question of land shortage. So I think we need to like remove that whole question from global strategies. Of course, locally it's relevant, but globally there is enough land to go around. We've written books on it. We have lots of reports on our website, etc. So it's important to remember that. Thirdly, the question we always ask people is, if you're going to be displaced in your country, whose door do you knock on? Is there a place where you can go, obviously, which is the people from government and maybe civil society that you can knock on and they'll help you? And most governments, most countries cannot answer that question affirmatively. Most people will say, well, I don't know, try that ministry, try that guy, you know, but nobody really knows. So that has to happen in every country, and every country can do that. And then let me get to this billionaire question. I've just finished writing an article a couple days ago about it, so it's all fresh in my mind. So we did all these other calculations. We've calculated that to rehouse let's take the average number, 400 million people displaced by climate change at an average cost of $9,000 per household. That's the price that it costs us. We have a housing program in Bangladesh, a tiny housing program. It's called One House, One Family at a Time. And this is a way for people anywhere in the world that want to contribute money where they know 100% of what they give will go to building houses. So we built a small amount. I mean, I wish it was 9 million houses. It's 9 houses around Chittagong, but nonetheless, it's something. And we're hoping to build 11 more this year. And just to put it on the map that, you know, this is a way that we can actually solve this problem much more concretely than people realize. So using that figure, we've calculated that it'll take, and this is going to sound like a lot, $3.6 trillion to rehouse all of the climate displaced people in the world, okay? Let me give you another figure. Guess how much American billionaires alone, 745 of them, earned during COVID last year? $2.1 trillion. More than half of what's needed by 745 people. There's more than 2,500 billionaires in the world now with a collective assets of around $15 trillion. You know, what we're proposing now, and I hope, Salim, you can raise this in Glasgow, is a climate displacement levy, okay? One-time climate displacement levy of 25% on every single billionaire in the world, spread over a 25-year period. So 1% of that per year would raise the amount of money we need from all of those Jeff Bezoses and Elon Musks and Richard Bransons and wannabe, but claims to be Donald Trump, etc. 88% of whom are male, by the way, of the world's billionaire class. It's very few are female. That money could be used in some sort of international fund, very well overseen, of course, to actually literally rehouse every single climate displaced person at a modest level, bearing in mind that we're not building mansions, we're building simple homes, but that it's doable again. And I want to emphasize that again, this is doable. We can do it. It's not a question of not having land. It's not a question of not having money. It's a question of will. And if we can get that will together, you know, collectively, all of us can really solve this problem. And then one last point, we're working also on this idea very closely linked to the ideas that Mizan Bai and Salim Bai are talking about, this idea of climate displacement havens or safe havens. So it can be on the intermediate urban level scale, like you're working on in Bangladesh, because you have so many of those cities. But we want to get that idea in the minds of everyone everywhere, that even the smallest village, particularly in countries that are losing population. So think of Italy, think of the eastern part of Germany, think of Japan, think of all these countries and regions, you know, the eastern part of cold weather Canada, all these places which are actually losing population, rural Australia. They can turn themselves into climate displacement havens and say, we're going to benefit by welcoming people here. It's going to pump our economy. It's going to solve their problem, and it's going to make the economy grow. And so it's a win-win-win. So let me stop there. Oh, and finally, look, you asked about human rights of climate displaced people. There's a lot of them, you know, there's a lot of rights associated with these. We have thousands of these, by the way. So if any of you want to get copies, just write to me and I'll send you a whole bunch.
Thank you, Scott. That's really interesting. And I completely agree with you that the main problem is political will. As you say, the resources are there, the land is there. It's just about getting the political will in the face of the opposition of vested interests. Mizan, is there anything that you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, just in 2-3 minutes. I have a class at 4. So, Scott, I like the numbers. I will request if you share your few articles with those very mind-boggling but very effective and convincing numbers that will help us as negotiators. Okay, so in terms of selective relocation abroad, that the model we have been espousing and advocating, yes, one thing is I fully agree that there is anti-immigration sentiment, but the other side of the coin is there is no denying that your countries, many of your countries already need young and skilled labor force. Okay. There is no denying, because I know the statistics in those countries and the growth rate. Many countries have negative population growth with increasingly huge aging population. So you need labor force. Now, it is up to the politicians as well as the young boys and girls, new voters, if they can be sensitized about, and our model does not advocate for wholesale immigration, only selective relocation of young, able-bodied and skilled and knowing good language of your countries, who are fluent and can speak your language and also well-trained with necessary skill, they will move. So it depends on the politicians and the young, because your democracies are more mature. So if young voters balk at the issues, you know, then your politicians must learn, must obey. Not that democracy is in our society, you know, politicians, you know, promise hundreds of things, and they don't care after the voting day. Only we have a democracy mainly on the election day. Okay, you know this culture. So I'm very optimistic. It all depends on the media and the mass and some money, 3 M's, in having an agenda, to hammer through some agenda, 3 M's, money, mass, and media. So we also need some money for raising advocacy, strong advocacy in industrial countries. And you know, there is, I strongly argue after this working group one report publication, that there is greater disconnect between science and policy in the so-called laggard developed countries, not in the EU, because EU is kind of an excellent boy in climate diplomacy, and we have been long working with them as partners. But non-EU industrial countries are laggards. And there is, we need to establish, bridge the gap between science and policy. And this requires money, So this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Mizan. Before I move on to the last question, I'd just like to post in the chat box Insight Collaborative's social media and website links. Please do follow us for more webinars like this. In November, we will be looking at humanitarian aid and the logistics and ethics of aid donations. It should be a really interesting discussion, so do keep an eye on our social media for that. And I now just move on to our last question of the day, which is, what can the global community do to support displaced people, and especially as the amount of people displaced by climate change grows? Now, we've partially discussed this already in the last question, but I would love to know if you've got any more thoughts on that. And Salim, would you like to start us off again?
Sure. Thank you very much. This is an extremely interesting discussion. So, so far we've been talking about what I call the real world problem of climate change causing people to be forced to be displaced. I now want to segue into the UNFCCC bubble world, and it is very much a bubble world. It has its own language, it has its own terminology, and in fact, the term climate migrant does not exist. The UNFCCC does not allow anybody to use the term climate migrant. It's not allowed. What we have to say is people who will be forcibly displaced because of climate change. That's the long version, okay, of what a climate, to you and me, that's a climate migrant, not to the UNFCCC. The term is taboo. You cannot call anybody a climate migrant, let alone a climate refugee, because refugee comes with, obligations under UN laws. So refugee is even more taboo. Even climate migrant is taboo. So going into the COP in the next few days, there is a very small area in which this issue does get addressed. And it again, for those of you who don't follow the COPs, it is inexplicable why we use this language. It's called loss and damage from climate change, all right? That's the terminology. In fact, it really means liability and compensation, but again, those are taboo words. We are not allowed to use the words liability and compensation, so we use the words loss and damage as a euphemism. And that's what global negotiations are all about, is you cannot use real world or real world terms. You have to invent new terms that have ambiguity associated with them that allow a discussion to take place without addressing the underlying issues. And that's what global negotiations are largely about. So going now in the next few days into COP26, a number of us, including the vulnerable countries, but also many civil society, including researchers like myself, are pushing for COP26 to address loss and damage in a much, much bigger way than they have ever done before. And that then covers the issue of forced displacement, or what we would call climate migrants, all right? And that really is where it sits in a very tiny corner of the UNFCCC language and the COPs. We need to take it out of that little corner and bring it center stage. And that's what we're trying to do. We are telling Boris Johnson and the COP26 presidency, you cannot confine us to this little place. It's called the Warsaw International Mechanism, by the way. We do have a little place to talk about it, but that's all they're going to let us do, talk about it, all right? They're not going to do anything about it. And so We want to break out of the little box they've put us in and go into the center stage. And the big issue there is if you don't address this, then be prepared for millions of climate migrants, which I know you all fear. You're all scared of it. So let's use that to scare them. The US military has just come out with a report on how climate change is going to be the big disaster for them. And the biggest thing that scares them is migrants. Migrants scare them shitless. So yes, let's use that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Salim. I think you're absolutely right that we have to use that as leverage almost in order to get people to do anything about this. John, before I turn to you, I just want to check in with Mizan. If you're able, I don't know if you have to go now, because I know you said you had to go at 4 at your time. So if you're able to join us and just leave us with our last few words, that would be great, but no worries if you've got to go. No, he may already be preparing for his class, fair enough. John, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, just last word from me. I will refer to the political will that Scott has referred to. We need to invest good amount of 3 M's that I mentioned: money, mass, and media, for generating political will across the world, for solving not just this climate displacement, but for raising ambition as well as raising adequate climate finance. So political will is the center focus. Thank you very much. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mizan, and thank you so much for joining us. John, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, the notion of environmental refugee was tested by a household from Kiribati in the New Zealand court. And they eventually rejected the notion there was such a thing as an environmental refugee. It's never been tested in Australia, and I'm almost certain the result will be exactly the same. So in the legal system, these things don't exist. Now, what has happened in the last 100 years for many of the small islands of the Pacific is people have made their own decisions, migrated, often short-term, but increasingly long-term. So migration has become, for many small island states, a normal phenomenon. It's expected of people. People expect that they will do it. No one is surprised when they do. And the population of some of the small island states, is like Tuvalu, is actually falling at the moment because of this migration. So people are making their own decisions about some of these kinds of things. It is also why a few years ago, the president of Kiribati talked about what he called migration with dignity. What he wanted to do was have a degree of migration, but people should be able to get good jobs. Not sweeping the floors in factories, not picking refuse off the streets or whatever, but something which would have dignity, good earnings, and enable them to send more remittances back to the people back home. So that's still at the back of many people's minds. And I think in many ways, the Pacific Island states that will go to COP26 next week will be looking at more finance for adaptation, which will enable them to get more into training, more into education, more into health services. That would be both necessary and useful and very valuable in itself, but would also help to skill people for taking up better migration opportunities somewhere else. And the somewhere else for most people will be New Zealand and Australia. But ironically, Australia is not very interested. Australia is very interested in getting unskilled workers to pick fruit, and indeed getting unskilled workers from Asia who will be on a citizenship path and the new visas which have just been announced a week ago. But the Pacific Islanders are being neglected. There are no pathways to citizenship for them, by and large, in Australia. So it's a complicated argument about migration, about employment, and about the viability of national economies.
Thank you. I think that's a really good point, and that's probably where a lot of governments have some fears around integration, is actually working out those economic questions. And I worry that they will prioritise that over the lives of migrants and over actually resolving the climate crisis. Scott, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, lo and behold, I just printed this out. This is in today's newspaper. Speaking of Australia, 2 former prime ministers wrote a letter of apology to Pacific leaders about Australia's apathy on the climate crisis. So at least, you know, some politicians in this country actually care about it, and certainly a lot of the population cares about it. And you know, this country really should be at the forefront of solving this problem instead of in last place. You know, Aussies say we need to go from worst to first, and we definitely need to go from worst to first, and we have everything we need to go to first, and yet we remain in last place in just about every indicator when it comes to climate change, particularly in terms of finding the solutions. So one thing Australia could do, for instance, and all countries could do this, of course, that, you know, traditionally we take a lot of migrants in this country, which is one of the great things that attracted me to this country in the first place. When COVID's not in the picture, you know, we were taking up to 250,000 immigrants a year with barely anyone batting an eye. Left wing, right wing, centrist, Green Party, didn't matter. Nobody cared. That people loved it, you know. So it wasn't made into a politicized issue at all. Those days will return sooner or later once COVID, you know, dwindles away. Why not Australia and all countries that can do so designate a specific immigration class status called climate displaced person and add that to the pre-existing immigration statuses to make sure that each country begins the process of recognizing it's a problem by creating at least some form of loose quota. 10,000 a year first, 25,000 a year later, maybe 100,000 a year, and finding ways by which you can facilitate the movement of people if they have nowhere else to go and if it's what they want to do. And if it's consistent with the possibilities locally, which here it most certainly is. So thinking about changes to immigration policy is a really important concrete thing people can advocate for. You know, we've mentioned the UN a few times. Salim Bhai mentioned very articulately the limited nature by which climate displacement is viewed by UNFCCC and all of the UN bodies that deal with this issue. It's the same with UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, who you would expect would have some sort of engagement with this issue. They have over 10,000 staff, that agency, and a multi-billion-dollar budget, and they do lots of great things, and I've worked for them myself many times. But on this issue, which is far, far larger than the issue of normal run-of-the-mill conflict-based displacement, they have done peanuts, really. There's a handful of staff members, if that, responsible for this, and I wouldn't know what their budget is on this, but it's also minuscule. So, you know, those institutions also need to change and become more practically oriented. I would say very few, if any, national governments in the world have a specific national budgetary item dedicated to resolving climate displacement in one way or another. That's another thing that you can advocate for. Try to get it into the platforms of your political parties. Try to get this as a premier issue. You know, I'm speaking to the Green Party here about it, and they'll probably do it at a certain point. Get that in there as a central theme. You know, another thing we advocate for all the time are climate land banks. Every country in the world can establish a climate land bank, which would be state land, public land held in trust by the state for exclusive use for resettlement or relocation of climate displaced people. Start it small. Start it with 1,000 acres, 5,000 acres. You don't have to spend any money. You use state land for this, but you hold it in trust. You keep it out of the market. You keep it out of commercial enterprise possibilities, and you have a place for people to fall back on. And you can combine that with the whole idea of climate displacement havens and all sorts of other policies, and then really start beginning to find concrete solutions. Because what's happening in lots of places, you know, it's not like Australia, for instance, is immune to climate migration or climate displacement. People are already moving in droves to the cold weather part of Australia because they're afraid of the heat. They're moving to Tasmania, you know, and the numbers are increasing, and they're moving, you know, into Victoria, where it's also colder than in most other parts of the country. And so, you know, this is already happening, and when you have enough money, you can move anywhere. But, you know, the vast majority of the world doesn't have enough money to move anywhere. So it has to be helped along, it has to be facilitated. Finally, I should also mention that, for what it's worth, I mean, there's potential behind this, but, you know, it has to be made into action. The UN Human Rights Council recently, for the first time, actually two things. For the first time, I wrote my master's thesis in 1986 on the right to environmental quality. It took until last month for this to be officially recognized by the UN Human Rights Council in 2021, if you can imagine that. You know, what is that, 35 years later, right? So, you know, eventually they did it. But what they also did, the same body at the same session, they approved the appointment of special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. So, you know, there's a lot of talk going on now. I'm involved in that too, trying to find the ideal candidate of, for once, a UN special rapporteur can really get the issue going, can really get issues on the agenda, can start talking about these trillions of dollars that are needed and really and spur action on this question. Because, you know, if we fail to do it, you know, we already have a lot of slum dwellers in this world, well over 1 billion. You know, also, when I started working on this issue, I actually thought by the time my career was in the latter parts, which it is now, that we would have almost solved the slum problem. We would have housed everybody in adequate conditions with security of tenure and all that. Not even close. They're now saying it's going to be 3 billion people in slums by 2040 or 2050, depending on how things go. And as Salim Bhai also said earlier, when you have no other option and you're living along the coastline near Chittagong or on some char, some small island off the coast, you're going to go to the city because it's the only option you've got. And guess what? You're last in line. You're not first in line in that slum. You're last in line. And if anybody's been to Bangladesh, and anybody's been to the Bangladesh slums, as I most certainly have, and 1,000 other slums all around the world, yes, they are solutions in a way, but given the chance, most people would not live there. They would much, much, much more happily be living in the suburbs. So, you know, we don't want a world of slums. You know, we want a world of adequately housed people whose rights are respected and who don't have to move because of the dominant economic system that we've chosen to have for the last 250 years that has resulted in changes to our environment, to our temperatures, to our sea levels, unprecedented in the age of humans. This Anthropocene that we are now living in has to be used as a motor for positive change. And we can take this horrible problem of climate change and this horrible problem of climate displacement and use it as an engine, not for despair and hatred and hope and paranoia, but one of true hope and a true realization that this can get us to the next level of human evolution, really, at the end of the day, whereby people everywhere realize that our similarities far outnumber our differences, and that we're stronger when we help each other and support each other and learn from each other. And if we do that, we can use this in a positive way.
Thank you, Scott. I think those are excellent words to draw the webinar to a close on, especially one where it's very easy to fall into to doom and gloom as it is on this kind of topic. And it's really good to end it with a bit of a message of hope. So thank you for that. So I'll just end by saying a huge thank you to our amazing panelists, Salim ul Hook, John Connell, Scott Leckie, and Mizan Khan for your contributions and for all the work that you're doing. I would encourage all of our attendees to keep an eye out for their work and some of their writings and so on, because I think you're all doing absolutely amazing stuff. And yeah, I hope we'll be able to appear on a discussion panel again someday.
Great. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Keep up the great work, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Ciao. Bye.